Well, a busy week for Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, who's about to begin her first round of major international discussions with the International Monetary Fund and World Bank spring meetings kicking off this week. And she peeled back the curtains a bit with remarks at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs this morning. And she had a specific call on a global effort to coordinate tax policy via a minimum corporate tax rate. Take a listen.
We're working with G20 nations to agree to a global minimum corporate tax rate that can stop the race to the bottom. Together, we can use a global minimum tax to make sure the global economy thrives based on a more level playing field in the taxation of multinational corporations and spurs innovation, growth, and prosperity.
So Janet Yellen right there saying that there's a case for a minimum corporate tax rate globally, but didn't say necessarily what that's going to be. But for more on this, let's bring in Brandon Arnold from the National Taxpayers Union, where he's an executive vice president. And Brandon, I just want to ask you, broadly speaking, about the idea of a globally coordinated minimum corporate tax rate. Do you think on balance that would be a better or worse for U.S. companies?
I think it would be worse for U.S. companies, no doubt about it. Here's what's happening. We're trying to raise our corporate tax rate. Biden is pushing that. A lot of congressional Democrats are pushing that, trying to go from 21% up to 28%. And here's an opportunity to shift blame, because when that takes place, if that does indeed take place, we're going to see a return to inversions, a return to corporations moving overseas to lower tax jurisdictions in Europe, elsewhere across the globe. And this is a way to shift blame for that by saying, well, if everybody would have held hands, worked together and agreed to some sort of global minimum tax, then we wouldn't have this problem. Of course, that isn't going to happen.
So let's talk a little bit more about that, Brandon. Let's get pretty realistic, because what is the likelihood that we're going to see all of these countries start to reverse the trend that has already been in place for quite some time of lowering some of those tax rates? How likely is it that we're going to see all the countries say, you know what, Janet, that's a great idea, and we're going to start seeing a spike in some of those corporate tax rates at home as well?
Yeah, I just don't see that happening. Like you said, this trend goes back decades. If you look at the corporate tax rate back in 1980, the average rate was about 40% globally. It's dropped down to about 24% globally. It's been a huge reduction. It's not just one or two countries doing this. It's not just Ireland. It's countries across Europe, across the industrialized world that are lowering their corporate tax rates to attract more businesses and more economic activities, and obviously the jobs that come with that. So to say that all these countries, again, are going to hold hands and suddenly agree to unwind what they've been doing for decades, I just don't think is realistic whatsoever. It's just not going to happen.
Now, Brandon, at the same time, what's been interesting is that you have some like Gary Cohn who have told us on this program that there is room for the United States to change or even raise the corporate tax rate, maybe as up to 35% or something to that effect. So what do we see as the appetite for some of these, especially large companies? When you think about Amazon getting a lot of flack for the amount of deferred credits that it's been able to have, so they don't need to pay a big bill for each given fiscal year. What do you think is the appetite among those large companies to maybe agree to some sort of modest increase under the Biden administration?
Yeah, I think there probably will be a little bit of an increase. People like Joe Manchin in the center of the Senate control so much power. And he has said that he is skeptical, even opposed to going all the way up to 28, but maybe would be amenable to something more in the 25 ballpark. What I'd like to see, regardless of where the rate ends up, and I hope it doesn't go up much, if at all, is to preserve a tax code that encourages investment. And that's one of the things that's concerning me about some of the proposals coming out of the Biden administration. It's even getting a little bit of a pushback from congressional Democrats that would disincentivize research and development investments, investments in infrastructure, in capital investments like machinery and equipment that will allow businesses to grow and be more globally competitive. That's what we're talking about. We're talking about instituting a corporate minimum tax within this country, which is also a very, very bad policy. So hopefully the rate doesn't go up much, but regardless of whether it moves up or not, we need to make sure we're investing in the resources to make sure our companies are valuing their presence in the United States such that they're making R&D investments, they're making capital investments, and so forth.
All right. So, Brandon, I know that you're saying that it's unlikely that a lot of countries are going to start increasing their corporate tax rates. Is there at all a thought on where some of the corporations here might flee to if we do see that tax rate spike up to 28%, especially if it's not paired, as you're mentioning, really incentives to have corporations stay here and really invest inside of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to go to lower tax jurisdictions, of course, but it's not just the rate. And I think that's really important here. It's having the R&D properly treated. So people aren't including R&D in the tax base here in the United States. It's making sure that we extend the bonus depreciation policies that were adopted in 2017 into permanence, hopefully, making those policies permanent. That's what's going to make corporations, it's going to lower effective tax rates, but it's also going to incentivize building more structures, building more machinery, equipment, those types of investments, the R&D investments. You mentioned Amazon. That's one of the ways that they really drive down their effective tax rate is by putting money in R&D. That's good for the economy. That helps our global competitiveness, and it creates jobs here in the United States.
And I did want to correct myself earlier. I said Gary Cohn said he would be okay with 35%. That was the old format. He was actually saying he might be okay with something closer to 28%, which is what the Biden administration